It's remake time once again, and we're bringing you one of the greatest Pokemon of all time, Suicune. It's also one of the most iconic Pokemon ever as the mascot of Pokemon Crystal, after already being popular as one of the legendary beasts from Gold and Silver. Its important role in Crystal's story was reprised in Heart Gold and Soul Silver, and it also had a huge role in Pokemon Forever, where it battled Dark Tyranitar. It had an unexpected but superb turn in Pokken, and in more recent times, its paradoxical time-traveling cousin Walking Wake has appeared. Let's not waste any more time because we've got a long video ahead of us. Because today, we need to know, how great were Suicune and Walking Wake actually? And in this video, we'll be going over these competitive formats. The biggest stereotype about Gen 2 OU is that it is all stall. The veracity of that stereotype is questionable at the very least, but any truth that the idea has come from are from Pokemon like Suicune. It is astonishingly bulky with its superb base HP and equally extraordinary defenses bolstered by the maxed out EV system, with amazing longevity thanks to Sleep Talk being able to successfully call rest. Pure Water typing was phenomenal for a defensive Pokemon as well, giving it nearly no weaknesses. Functionally just electric, since there were just about no worthwhile grass moves, and really only Stab Electric would actually pose any genuine immediate threat to Suicune's colossal bulk. It also gave Suicune a solid stab move to work with offensively, so it wasn't just a blob that took hits, unlike say Skarmory and its Drill Peck. No, Surf was excellent coverage that helped it perform its function, as well as its deceptively high speed stat. A wall that takes hits is great, a wall that takes hits and is fast is even better. Suicune might be at low HP, but with its solid speed it could rest safely in front of plenty of offensive threats as opposed to say Blissey. Suicune was so tanky and so resilient that it wasn't too much of a stretch to refer to as a semi-accurate approximation of what Lugia would be like in OU. Suicune was so good at taking hits, it sometimes didn't even run Sleep Talk, as it hardly needed the extra reinforcement to its longevity that was calling rest in its sleep, and this way it would be more directly threatening by being able to fit more moves, mostly Roar. The other moves would generally be Toxic, occasionally Ice Beam, which had always fit into its Sleep Talk set, but it wouldn't run both on Sleep Talk less sets because Roar was too important and was a move it omitted from its Sleep Talk sets, as the move failed when called by Sleep Talk in Gen 2 if used against faster Pokemon. Suicune's good speed worked against it here, funnily enough. Suicune was a solid phaser with spike support, with its many positive matchups across the OU tier, and there being few Pokemon capable of threatening it, meaning it was consistently able to spread significant damage on the opposing side. You'd retreat your Tyranitar from it and switch to Zapdos only to get roared into Machamp, which couldn't take Suicune on safely either. Yeah, that thing with curse boosted base 130 attack stab cross chops that Suicune didn't even resist. So you'd switch to Zapdos again only to get roared into Nidoking, which Suicune also countered. Furthermore, being able to stifle Vaporeon with Roar allowed Suicune to act as an early game check to it, as opposed to the more dangerous route of Vaporeon Surfs wearing down the legendary Electric on Suicune's team, forcing it to rest and compromising its ability to take Vaporeon on once it had a growth. Suicune could also do this with Toxic, forcing a rest from Vaporeon, but Roar extended the damage to Vaporeon's teammates too. It wasn't that Suicune 100% walled entire teams, but instead forced the opponent into very difficult restricting positions in order to try and leverage their few ways of dealing with it, which made breaking through the defensive core supporting Suicune even tougher. It could mess with even Snorlax, and to really drive home the earlier idea of its lack of weaknesses, Suicune could also be an effective answer to Exeggutor, a grass type, since its stab weapon was psychic. Even if Exeggutor did run the occasional Giga Drain, it was still about a 50% chance to 3-hit KO Suicune from full health, and between Suicune's high speed and Giga Drain's meager 8 PP, the Exeggutor user would have to do some serious maneuvering to make the move worth its while. Otherwise, Exeggutor would have to settle for exploding, which it still had to time well, since the move didn't even KO Suicune. Most of the time, it wouldn't KO Suicune even after Spike's damage. Speaking of Exeggutor, it was a main reason why, as nice as occasional Roar variants were, Suicune did usually stick with Sleep Talk sets. The reinforcement of its bulk and longevity gave it more flexibility in battle, both in terms of responding to the opponent and being able to actually threaten in return, and a significant part of this was in its ability to absorb sleep moves from common users, which Suicune was an effective answer to. Exeggutor's Sleep Powder and Lovely Kiss from Jinx, and especially Nidoking, the latter being one of the tier's toughest mixed attackers to withstand, Suicune was especially prized for its ability to take Nidoking on, shrugging off even its thunders while complicating things for its attempts to break through by speed tying it, letting it both rest up and threaten Surf in equal measure. If it had Ice Ice Beam in its arsenal, a Sleep Talk would always cause something useful against Nidoking, though it generally got by just fine with the 2/3 of Surf and Rest with how well it took hits. Speaking of mixed attackers, Suicune was often paired with its fellow legendary beast Raikou, and the double dog combo, as it was referred to, shut down every mixed attacker in the game, giving the defensive teams they anchored an incredible amount of coverage against so many threats in just 2 slots. As such, these two were often considered essential on the very best stall teams, not just because their seemingly unbreakable defensive prowess, but also because they were so apt offensively in return. Sure, Suicune wasn't quite Raikou tier, but the combination of Toxic and Stab Surf was a highly efficient one, as the latter smacked the tier's poison resist well enough to make Toxic very easy for Suicune to spread. Suicune was especially dominant in GSC's heyday and many years afterwards, but if it had any flaw, it was that it was only really good on stall teams. Sure, theoretically it could fit on other teams with gimmicky sets like Mirror Coat to bounce back legendary Electric Thunders, but this was incredibly unreliable and thus never used by players at the highest level. Suicune being stall exclusive wasn't really an issue during the reign of stall, but as the metagame developed, the Gen 2 is all stall stereotype was resoundingly disproved as new styles of offensive teams began to appear, eventually taking over the metagame and shaping it in their image. Stall teams in general began struggling to keep up, and new styles of stall, often without Suicune, were explored to try and adapt this more fast-paced metagame. Suicune soft-countered many Pokemon, which meant its role wasn't quite as essential, or more importantly, irreplaceable, and thus players could justify trying new types of teams without it. Of course, nothing could quite do what Suicune did, so it was far from displace or outclass or any of the sort. It was just rarer than it had been for these reasons. All that having been said, Suicune stall teams were also not exactly some sort of outdated rarity. Though it was lower relative to what they had prior, they still saw plenty of uses and success, largely in part thanks to Suicune's unkillability. After all, there was nothing more infuriating than loading up the famed stall killer Marowak, getting past Skarmory, and oh, never mind, there's a Suicune, so you're out of luck. The new styles of offense teams had partly been designed to deal with Suicune stall, as that had been the dominant style at the time of their inception, but such was the power of Suicune that it could thrive even against such teams, especially once the likes of Jinx became popular. So all in all, Suicune was an outstanding definitive part of Gen 2 OU in every way imaginable. With the arrival of Generation 3, EVs were no longer maxed out across the board. Furthermore, Sleep Talk was now no longer able to summon Rest. So was Suicune done for? Not even close. In fact, it got better. How was this possible? Well, it was pretty much solely thanks to one newly added move, Calm Mind. Now, Suicune could leverage its titanic physical bulk to boost its special attack and special defense repeatedly, turning it into one of the scariest sweepers around, bypassing its initially underwhelming special attack and bolstering its special defense to unbreakable levels. It was just about unkillable on both sides of the spectrum after a single boost, which let it boost more, resting as needed until its surf would roll through everything. A famous saying during Gen 3 was, "Bold Suicune has no weak," and despite being grammatically incorrect, the sentiment was accurate. In the type-based physical special system of the first 3 generations, water types had no physical weaknesses, which made Suicune an amazing physical hit taker with a bold nature and maximum defense investment, and its weaknesses to electric and grass, being special, were ameliorated after Calm Mind, meaning it effectively did indeed have no weak. Of course, important though it is, the type chart is not the only factor in Pokemon, and not having any type weaknesses post Calm Mind didn't mean Suicune was flawless. Gen 3's introduction of permanent Sandstorm and multiple layers of spikes and being affected by both of them was easily Suicune's biggest flaw. It was especially exploitable in this regard since it didn't have reliable recovery, instead having to use rest and wasn't very strong initially, so it could be played around with passive damage quite decently, with other tactics like Toxic and particularly Celebi's Leech Seed helping slow it down early in the game before Suicune was ready to take over. Finally, the lack of a rock resist and reliable recovery meant Suicune couldn't be a team's go-to answer to Tyranitar and Aerodactyl, or potentially even Salamence if it didn't run Ice Beam as it often did. None of these problems were unmanageable though. For example, simply pairing Suicune with Rapid Spin Claydol helped reinforce defenses against both spikes and rock slides. Also, Many was the team that, once Suicune was the last Pokemon and could no longer be phased out, was simply helpless against it. Additionally, Additionally, the last move chosen for its move slot could also help rectify certain issues. For instance, Roar in the last move slot, alongside Spike's support of its own, could help play around the likes of Celebi or force Spike's damage in general by dragging an opposing Pokemon even when faced with a Spike's immune counter it couldn't beat on its own. Especially defensive Roar Zapdos. Roar also expanded Suicune's defensive reach by allowing it to boost alongside and then phase out opposing Calm Mind Suicune. In fact, Roar Suicune had the habit of investing in a few speed EVs to beat opposing Roar Suicune to the Roar, and the move also allowed Suicune to dominate Calm Mind Wars against Jirachi, as well as completely destroying Cursed Snorlax. Roar was also useful on Suicune when used as a lead, since it could take advantage of how it scared out Tyranitar and Salamence leads to reveal the opponent's team and gain information early on. The real crown jewel in Suicune's moveset though was Sleep Talk, which became one of the most famous sets in Pokemon history. It's named Crocoon after the player who popularized it, Cromat, and its popularity and impact was such that ever since, any Pokemon with a boosting move, Rest, Sleep Talk, and Coverage can be referred to with the Crow prefix. Crocoon was so terrifying because Sleep Talk meant just forcing it to rest wasn't necessarily enough for a lot of would-be counterplay, whether it was phasing or blasting it with damage. You would try and whirlwind it out with Skarmory only to be crushed by a boosted Surf. Same with trying to explode on it with Metagross. You would try to overwhelm it with Zapdos' Thunderbolt, only for Sleep Talk to pull another Calm Mind out, and now suddenly you couldn't threaten it anymore. Even before it was ready to sweep, Sleep Talk was effective for ensuring Suicune wasn't a sitting duck once forced to rest. You could still threaten a host of Pokemon with Surf, ensuring that Tyranitar couldn't safely go for Choice Banded Focus Punch, for example. Regardless of whether it ran Sleep Talk or Roar, Suicune, for all of its flaws, was so powerful when it got going that it regularly had games where it just started boosting and never stopped, running away with the match with how incredibly quickly it could snowball into an unstoppable behemoth. The fact that it had pressure as its ability also meant you would run out of power points on your attacks against it quite quickly. Even something as strong as Banded Tyranitar or Aerodactyl could only rock slide it 8 times, which was absolutely nothing considering how Suicune loved going the distance in long games. Pressure also helped it stall Celebi's Leech Seeds, and in a pinch, it could even beat the Vaporeon that ostensibly blanked it. No matter how good your team was, how theoretically prepped you were for Suicune, it could and would still mess you up with shocking consistency. Sometimes you just lose to Suicune right off the bat. In fact, it was practically a rite of passage for every advanced player to, at least once, lose to a Suicune that led off, used Calm Mind on the first turn, and never switched out en route to a sweep. That'll teach you to respect it. Suicune was so threatening in this regard, it was considered a top 3 Pokemon in the tier, right behind Tyranitar and Celebi. It was ferocious on both bulky Spikes teams, playing the long game, or on a dual trap teams where alongside Curselax, it provided both the defensive backbone against threats like Salamence, as well as late game sweeping potential to fully take advantage of how much Magneton and Dugtrio trapped in tandem, including one of its biggest checks it happened to share with Lax and Leech Seed Celebi. Now, Suicune wasn't necessarily beholden to going max HP, max defense, and generally playing a very slow game fitting slower teams. Certain top players experimented with a more offensive variant that fit on faster paced teams. A modest, highly special attack invested Suicune tended to come close to max with Hydro Pump as a stab, dealing enormous immediate damage to Pokemon that would expect to take uninvested Surfs, such as Snorlax for example. With powered up Ice Beams, the likes of Celebi and Zapdos weren't going to want to tangle with it either, especially if Suicune invested in enough speed to outrun their standard slow, bulky variants. It just run them over, almost before they could respond, and with Substitute as its last move, it would happily dodge Desperation Boons from Metagross or Snorlax. Its base 100 HP meant with max investment, it hit a 404 HP stat, meaning its substitutes had 101 HP, enough to not be broken by Seismic Toss, and thus letting it mess with Blissey as well, while being even more ruinous to Leech Seed attempts from slower Celebi, allowing Suicune to set up even further in its face, and it completely destroyed Milotic, who was hapless against it if it was unable to Toxic, as it had yet to gain access to the haze it received in Gen 4. These hard-hitting sub-Suicunes were definitely effective on the rare occasion they showed up. Nothing quite like cleanly one-hit KOing a full-health Tyranitar with Hydro Pump, but were on the rarer side, until a new wave of advanced players, inspired by both these modest subsets and the all-out offensive Suicune boom of Generation 4, decided to try a similar variant of the set in Generation 3. For those unaware, older generations continue to be played even once they are no longer current, and sometimes trends in newer generations can influence past generations that were not considered a strategy before. All-out offensive Suicune was a prime example. Previously, going anything except defensive with it would be considered an offbeat experimentation experimentation of a select few top players, nothing that would become meta. But now offensive Suicune led the charge of a new style of team that entrenched itself as a modern advanced staple, Calm Mind Spam, where it was flanked by two other Calm Minders, usually known for their slow, bulky approach, yet now taking the tier by storm with speed and power, Celebi and Jirachi. What these Pokemon lost in defensive resilience, they made up for in spades with sheer offensive threat, and Suicune especially was, of course, still quite bulky even without investment. This new offensive Suicune didn't run max HP or substitute in the last slot. It wanted max special attack to hit as hard as possible. It wanted max speed or very close to it to capitalize on its solid base speed stat, the same as Heracross, and it wanted HP Grass in the last slot to smash through the tier's common waters. Suddenly, offensive Suicune was every bit as popular as defensive, as the dynamic of the tier shifted to accommodate the possibility of it being strong and fast. For example, even bulky Celebi and Zapdos often invested in enough speed to outrun max modest Suicune if they were their team's answer to it, lest they be completely bowled over. While even offensive Zapdos often invested in enough special defense to survive modest Calm Mind boosted Ice Beam plus Sandstorm. During this time, the metagame shifted away from its previous stature, with bold Suicune as an undeniable top 3 Pokemon. The increased emphasis on powerful rock slides from Tyranitar and Aerodactyl in conjunction with Spikes meant Suicune's competition with Swampert was more stringent than ever, seeing as it lacked both the rock slide recess and the ability to heal in sand. Having said that, it was still, of course, an undeniably elite Pokemon, whether defensive or offensive. It just wasn't quite as dominant in this new metagame, optimized in a different direction, where the multi-pronged assault of Spikes and dual rocks was also backed by a new top 3 Pokemon, the bulky Gengar whose Will-O-Wisp burned everything in sight. Soon, offensive Suicune began experimenting with other moves over HP Grass in its 4th move slot. The best and most common was Roar. Calm Mind Blissey had appeared to combat this rise in Calm Mind spam offense, but if it tried to counter Suicune, Suicune would simply boost up repeatedly, then blow it away and likely win the game on the spot. This lent Calm Mind spam offense an even greater level of threat. Substitute also popped up against its explosion blocking capabilities. Then as Calm Mind Blissey gave way to more standard variants that took on offensive Suicune without needing to boost, Suicune adapted by slotting Toxic into its 4th move slot. Suddenly, Blissey would be unable to stand up to Suicune one-on-one, and if Blissey didn't want to be taken out, it would have to switch out, which meant something else on his team would get absolutely eviscerated by a boosted Hydro Pump. This made Suicune and his teammates as a result absolutely horrendous to deal with for such teams, being able to turn an otherwise difficult matchup into a completely fine one. Offensive Suicune was also an excellent lead, able to pile on the aggression right from turn 1 with its positive matchups against Salamence and Tyranitar, and any banded Metagross lead looking to blow up early might be met with a substitute. A major paradigm shift came for Suicune when it was discovered that Sleep Talk mechanics had been implemented incorrectly on simulators all the years Advance had been played. Put simply, if you used Sleep Talk and then switched out without burning a sleep turn, you would effectively not have burned any sleep at all. Think of it like this: you use rest, so you have 2 turns of sleep left. You use Sleep Talk the next turn, then you switch out. You'd think you'd have 1 turn of sleep left, right? Nope, you still actually have 2. This was a devastating blow to Sleep Talkers. Now you had to be very careful about its use in battle, to say nothing of including it in a moveset to begin with. If you used it poorly, you'd extend your own sleep duration, which would very rarely be worth it, and if you weren't using it, then you had a useless move slot. Thus, Crocoon disappeared for a time, but it then came roaring back in a brand new form. Well, not literally roaring, but instead sleep talking with a modest nature. It weaponized all the usual Crocoon strengths, such as turning Blissey into setup fodder, and with its modest gain power, it shredded the now standard specially defensive Skarmory that might attempt to phase it, making it one of the biggest threats to the most dominant standard team styles in the metagame and a crucial tool for offensive tools that otherwise might struggle against them. But what about that Sleep Talk mechanic change? Well, it was something to be kept in mind, but the upsides were worth it, and even more importantly, the fact was that Suicune could use its famed no weak style to stay in and slug it out with just about everything after a boost. It often didn't have issues with the Sleep Talk or switch mechanic because it was so difficult to force it out to begin with. Modest Crocoon was yet another example of Suicune. Despite always being a calm minder of some sort with a limited offensive move pool, still finding, through inventiveness and experimentation, seemingly endless potential to adapt its moveset and expand how it could threaten the opponent. All it truly needed was Calm Mind and that perfect mono-attacking coverage move, Surf. One would think Substitute and Rest sets were diametrically opposed in terms of playstyle, but lo, for Sub-Rest Suicune, taking a cue from similar sets in Generation 6, combined Sub's propensity for fast-paced games and explosion blocking with Rest's longevity longevity and ability to shut down Blissey. Alternatively, instead of rest, Roar was also an excellent option, allowing Suicune to dominate Calm Mind Wars while maintaining the ability to set up all over Milotic and block Explosion. Furthermore, one could run Rain Dance. The extra boost to its Surf was nice to help Suicune blast through attempts to stall it out through bulky resist like Milotic and Celebi, and it was nice on the occasional Rain Dance team to help set up the mighty Kingdra. But its main use was allowing Suicune to clear the permanent Sandstorm and gift itself the ability to actually heal passively with Leftovers, which did wonders for its longevity. This was already on full display on certain trap teams that also incorporated weather removal. If there was no sand around, Suicune was the most unkillable Pokemon around and was the #1 reason why most players kept their Tyranitar usage very high. Rest Suicune would punish you harder than anything if you didn't, though sometimes it would push this to an extreme with a sub-protect set also inspired by Gen 6. Then again, on certain hyper-specific, extremely aggressive teams, Suicune didn't even necessarily need to run Leftovers. We can't stress enough the specificity of this, but the use of Select Berry on lead offensive Suicune led to significant success and metagame impact. Suicune naturally tended to get knocked into low health, so Select taking advantage of that by removing fast revenge killers, everything from Salamence to Dugtrio to Aerodactyl, could be game-changing and allowed Suicune to really slash through offensive teams, leaving so much damage in its wake that its teammates would have easy pickings. Inspired by the similarly effective Select Vaporeon, this Suicune set even turned the tables on its nemesis offensive Zapdos with ruthless efficiency. The possibilities were nearly endless, as no matter what Suicune did, it was always an elite Pokemon that always ranked among the most defining forces in Generation 3 OU. Bold Suicune was unperturbed by Generation 4's faster pace and greater power from all angles. Stealth Rock, Life Orb, Choice Specs, huge base power moves, a physical special split meaning you could actually hit Suicune super effectively on the physical side now, as best exemplified by the newly threatening Breloom Seed Bomb. No matter, Bold Suicune has no weak. This wasn't literally the case anymore. Again, Loom, and in early Diamond and Pearl, there was also Thunder Punch Electivire, but Suicune was so bulky it may as well have been the case. Crocoon was a defining metagame force once again. Ice Beam was also a popular choice, as in Diamond and Pearl, it was often tasked with taking on the monstrous Garchomp, while Platinum brought about another menace in Outrage Salamence. Regardless, Suicune was business as usual, and this meant once again being one of the best, most popular Pokemon around, anchoring several of the most successful teams and being favored by top players for its incredible consistency in the face of hugely powerful threats like Infernape and the Latias that dropped to OU during Platinum. The Platinum metagame also saw the emergence of the offensive Suicune mentioned during the Generation 3 segment, though it was actually offensive Suicune's excellence in Gen 4 that inspired Gen 3 players to go back and try it there, based on the principle it established in Gen 4. It didn't just have to be slow, bulky, and not too threatening before it got going with Calm Mind. It could be fast, immediately powerful, and could bowl teams over with an all-out approach. The surprise factor helped it out at first, for sure, outspeeding and decking Breloom that thought they would wall Crocoon, or at least survive an uninvested Ice Beam. But even once the surprise factor wore off, offensive Suicune was an utter terror, and quickly established itself as a new metagame standard, so much so that it eclipsed defensive Suicune in usage, making bold variants the odd ones out. It wasn't that they were bad, they were still very good. It was just that offensive Suicune brought so much to teams, and could be slotted everywhere, from all-out offensive squads to more spikes-heavy balanced teams, with its amazing blend of defensive utility, with new utility partially wrenched from its invested speed and offensive power that made it an excellent cleanup Pokemon. One of the best tools one could have in the late game against other offensive threats, as its incredible typing and bulk meant it could take a hit from just about anything, while threatening greatly in return against common Pokemon like Gengar and Latias, providing a major advantage. At first, offensive Suicune was actually all about dealing as much damage as possible, holding Life Orb to unleash truly brutal levels of power after a Calm Mind. However, as devastating as it could be, for it to so mercilessly rip through bold Zapdos and Celebi, it was discovered that Leftovers was the superior item. Not that Life Orb was unviable, but it was relegated to very specific teams, whereas Lefties was the more universally useful option to get the most out of Suicune's natural bulk, which was one of its best traits. By making the most of its bulk as well as its longevity, one could, on average, actually get more offensive mileage out of Suicune, as it was now more adept at switching into something like Scarf Heatran Fire Blast. Offensive Suicune's main defensive use was actually taking on Gyarados, which it was one of the best checks too. Whereas Taunt Gyro was usually an answer to bold Suicune variants, offensive Suicune with HP Electric shut it down incredibly hard. With a timid nature, Suicune also outsped Adamant Lucario and had more than enough bulk to take boosted extreme speed with Aplomb. Depending on the matchup, it could either be used as a defensive check to threats like these, or it could be held back until the timing was right for it to unleash the full brunt of its terror, fully capitalizing on how difficult it was to take out in a beautiful pairing with immediate offensive threat level. Many teams' quote-unquote best answer was going to Latias, tricking Suicune choice specs and getting obliterated by the boosted Ice Beam. Offensive Suicune's excellence firmly established it as one of the metagame's defining standards, continuing well into Heart Gold and Soul Silver. After the bans of Latias and Salamence, Fire Water Grass cores emerged as the tier's new go-to strategy, and offensive Suicune was a serious contender for the most popular water amongst such cores. Even after Fire Water Grass cores slowed down in popularity, Suicune continued to excel. It was so popular, some players started running Abomasnow to take it on. Suicune didn't slow down though, as it saw a great deal of experimentation that gave its game further depth. It was usually in some offensive vein, but there were also bulky Rest Talk Roar sets, which dropped Combine entirely, were briefly popular as a non-Stealth Rock weak alternative to Rest Talk Gyarados that was a fixture on stall teams at the time. They allowed Suicune to immediately spread damage on the opposing team through shuffling alongside entry hazards, as opposed to needing the boost of Calm Mind in order to be threatening. Most of the time though, it was variations on offensive Suicune, usually seeing it drop hidden power electric. The first alternative was Roar. This allowed Suicune to function by and large like its regular offensive set, but when paired with spikes, it was now able to put an enormous amount of pressure on Blissey, letting it threaten defensive teams it otherwise struggled against. It also allowed it to destroy the special defense invested Chestoberry Dragon Dance Rest Kingdra that had popped up as an alternative answer to it. Another alternative that appeared was Protect. This paired beautifully with Toxic Spikes to help Suicune gain extra chip damage against Pokemon like Shaman, and scouted the intentions of choice attackers, which were a common revenge killing tool against Suicune. For example, no longer did you have to guess whether that Scarf Rotom Wash was going to Thunderbolt or Trick, or predict you to switch out and Hydro Pump your Tyranitar switch. Furthermore, if Scarf Heatran attempted to explode on you, you KO'd it for free. If Sand wasn't in play, Protect was also superb for allowing Suicune to grab as much leftovers recovery as possible, making it even tougher to wear down. Offensive Calm Mind Protect Suicune even started seeing use as a lead, able to put a ton of pressure on all sorts of teams right off the bat, and able to provoke explosions from the likes of Metagross and Azelf. It would then blank with Protect. Finally, the same sub-Protect Calm Mind Suicune mentioned in Gen 3, inspired by its use in Gen 6, saw use on the occasional Rain team, fully taking advantage of the team's style removal of Sand. Suicune did admittedly dislike the rise of Clefable, as it was less able to maneuver its way around it in the ways it would Blissey thanks to Clef's hazard immunity and access to both Knockoff and Encore. But Clefable was not impossible to remove, and many items would simply collapse against Suicune once Clefable was taken out or even sufficiently weakened. Suicune also enjoyed the re-addition of Latias. Suddenly it had a teammate which could very easily and viably Healing Wish Suicune back to full health. Suicune could sometimes get worn down through direct and indirect damage alike before it could fully blast through a team, but then you'd basically have your second Suicune. So all in all, whichever guise it took, Suicune was a superb defining Pokemon in the 4th generation of OU. Generation 5's insane power creep upended previous standards, bringing about happenings previously unthinkable. Yes, that meant Suicune was no longer able to keep up in OU. Several major factors contributed to this. The addition of Ferrothorn, the addition of Jellicent, Rotom Wash now being half water and thus resisting Suicune's moves, in addition to turning it into momentum with Volt Switch, the plethora of overpowered Rain Sweepers that overshadowed offensive Suicune's power and speed, what seemed like 3 times over, while also plummeting it, lots of 100% accurate Thunders being thrown around, and the addition of incredibly powerful new threats like Terrakion and Volcarona that bulky Suicune couldn't much keep up with either. Oh, and thanks to Generation 5's new mechanics where the sleep counter reset upon switching out, rest talk strategies were dead on arrival. Yep, there was no room for Suicune in Gen 5 OU. It did make the shortest of appearances in Black and White 2, where it was used on incredibly specific Tailwind hyper offense teams. Tailwind was something it had over Keldeo, allowing it to double its team's speed, so monsters like Choice Band, Cure Silver and Black could destroy everything, while posing a decent enough offensive threat itself, especially since it liked running Life Orb Hidden Power Fire to lure Ferrothorn. However, that was pretty much as niche as it got. It had the tiniest handful of tour success, but once it was no longer surprising, it disappeared. Suicune dropped into UU as soon as the tier began existing, and there it was absolutely excellent throughout the entire generation. It hated the new sleep mechanics, but it still used bulky rest sets early on, as it was useful for staving off the tier's big threats, especially the terrifying fire types, and when paired with Heal Bell on stall teams, it could get around those mechanics. It could threaten opponents immediately with Roar alongside Hazard, but its water stab was also much better this time around. Having received Scald, the tier's power level was also much lower, and thus offensive Suicune was a perfect fit, functioning almost exactly as it had in the previous generation of OU, minus having to worry about permanent sand once that got banned. It wasn't just that Suicune's playstyle was the same, it was that Generation 5 UU bore a great resemblance to Generation 4 OU, with Suicune squaring off against many of the same Pokemon, like Kingdra, Swampert, Empoleon, Shaman, Roserade, Nidoqueen, Heracross, Zapdos, Lygon, Togekiss, Snorlax, Bronzong, Machamp, and before Hail was banned, even Abomasnow. Suicune was actually quite good on Hail teams itself. It loved being able to use a Can't Miss Blizzard as its ice coverage, letting it absolutely shatter the Zapdos and Grass types that tried to check it. Suicune didn't just enjoy the fact that Gen 5 UU was like Gen 4 OU. The fact Suicune was as good as it was, in the same way that it was a direct, significant contributor to this feeling the player base had. It was right down to still running Hidden Power Electric as coverage, even though there was no Gyarados in the tier. Suicune still preferred it to Grass for its ability to hit Empoleon as well as Quillfish. Of course, Suicune was also superb on offensive spikes with the same set except Roar over HP Electric. Offensive Suicune was its go-to, a fixture for its blend of offensive threat alongside natural bulk and typing, which gave its offensive teams valuable recourse against threats like Scarf Flygon, Victini, and Darmanitan. But sometimes good old Crocoon popped up. It was the advanced principle of the sleep and switch mechanics might be bad, but if you can't force a boosted Suicune to switch out, then it might not matter. So all in all, Suicune was an excellent Pokemon in Gen 5 UU. Gen 5 also saw Suicune venture into VGC. It could use its great bulk and decent offensive threat to support its team not just by taking hits and striking back at threats, but by providing speed control, whether that was the spread move Icy Wind or with the speed doubling Tailwind, both of which enable its hard-hitting teammates to frightening degrees. Suicune could also pose a threat itself with Calm Mind. It had solid variety in its item choice as well, ranging from the electric weakening Wakan Berry to the harder hitting Life Orb to the health recovering Citrus Berry to even occasionally going with the Rest Chesto Berry combination, meaning there were plenty of ways Suicune could provide support. At the 2013 Houston Regionals, both first and second place respectively used Suicune. Oliver Valenti reached second place with a max HP, nearly max special attack Chesto Rest Icy Wind variant, while Ben Irons won with a bold Citrus Calm Mind variant. Interestingly, both players' Suicune supported a choice spec Zapdos. Furthermore, Steven Morioka reached top 4 with Suicune at the North American March International Challenge. Tiffany Stanley reached 12th at the US Nationals, while Jacob P reached 7th in the senior division. Rachel Anand reached top 8, and Albert B made top 4 at the UK Nationals, and Christopher K reached top 16 at the German Nationals. At Worlds, Suicune appeared at 20th place in the senior division as part of Edward Fan's team. In the Masters division, it was used by Albert Benares to reach 24th, Daniel Nolan to reach 30th, Rachel Anand to reach 36th, and Y Yin Lo to reach 41st. Overall, Suicune had a solid place in Gen 5 VGC. It wasn't a world beater, but it was an important, successful Pokemon nonetheless. Sleep mechanics reverted in Generation 6, and Suicune returned to OU. It wouldn't remain a true OU Pokemon by usage throughout the generation, but it would always maintain a high degree of viability, usage, and success, including at one point being the most despised Pokemon in the tier. All in good time though. Offensive Suicune wasn't going to be making any waves in an OU tier that just kept getting faster and stronger, with Keldeo its most direct competition being one of the best Pokemon around. But good old defensive Suicune was perfectly happy to leverage its enormous bulk and Scald to offer some defensive stability, especially now that its reliance on rest for recovery wasn't a death sentence, and almost as importantly, weather was no longer permanent. This was huge as Tyranitar's permanent sand was the single greatest inhibitor of Suicune's longevity in generations 3 through 5, and Suicune was at its most dangerous when it didn't have to contend with it, like now. It didn't hard counter too many Pokemon, but its huge bulk and great typing let it play around a great deal. It was a great pivot into many moves' various threats like Aegislash and Mega Mawile, and it was tanky enough to where it didn't immediately collapse if it took a stray Solar Beam from Mega Charizard Y, for example. It could switch out and rest it off later against a Specs Keldeo locked into Scald, for instance. Furthermore, if it had Roar, it could help ward off the trio of Mega Dragon Dancers in Charizard X, Gyarados, and Tyranitar, while with Sleep Talk, it could potentially quickly snowball out of control in classic Crocoon fashion, proving to have no weak even in the Mega generation. Many teams would quickly find themselves despairing as even Thunderous Thunderbolt would start bouncing off. Basically, Suicune found itself in great form as it pulled its usual defensive rest Suicune tricks in Generation 6 OU from X and Y throughout ORAS, a valuable part of many successful teams. As good as Suicune was in OU, nobody could deny that its usage wasn't quite enough for the tier, and thus it returned to UU, where it once again did Suicune things and was one of the most excellent Pokemon around. It was one of the most significant figures in the bulky Water Wars that were such a central dynamic of the metagame. In fact, ORAS UU was often referred to as the bulky water tier, as there were so many electric options and the waters themselves tended to clash a lot in game. Waters, especially Suicune, thanks to its potential to quickly spiral into a game winner thanks to Calm Mind, beat an enormous portion of the tier one-on-one, giving them plenty of opportunity, and thanks to the burning power of Scald, not all but most of the Pokemon capable of taking on waters without getting utterly destroyed in the process were other waters. This resulted in riveting gameplay where, bereft of other options, two trainers would order their water types to scald each other repeatedly, hoping for the burn. Suicune was involved in a lot of these, because with rest it could actually heal the burn off itself and not require the support of a cleric like Aromatherapy Florges. This was excellent both in the team builder and in battle. Suicune also boasted the ability to become one of the scariest sweepers in the tier, snowballing out of control at a moment's notice. Its fellow bulky waters like Slowking, Empoleon, and Seismitoad, great as they were, didn't pack anywhere near such utility. Suicune's ability to shrug off burns like this was also excellent in letting it take on fellow legendary beast Entei and its Sacred Fire, especially since with pressure, it halved Sacred Fire's already low 8 PP. Finally, as always, Suicune's superb physical bulk let it eat up all manner of physical threats, most notably the tier's best Mega, Aerodactyl. All in all, Suicune was an excellent part of UU once again, with classic Suicune antics that fit in perfectly with the structure of the tier. To conclude Gen 6, we're jumping back to OU. Standard bulky Suicune was always great, yes, but near the end of the generation, a groundbreaking new set appeared, one that revolutionized the use of Suicune more than any adaptation since the original Crocoon, and one that was almost surely more infuriating to play against. Remember how in the section of Gens 3 and 4, we referred to a sub-protect Suicune inspired by one that came from Gen 6? Remember how at the beginning of this very Gen 6 section, we mentioned Suicune briefly becoming the most hated Pokemon in OU? Well, those two things are one and the same. Stall was ruling the metagame, and a player named Vince2612 came up with a Suicune set meant to turn the tables on such teams, perfectly capitalizing on Suicune's newfound freedom in a world without permanent sand, Sub, Protect, Calm Mind, and Scald. It wasn't just an anti-stall set either. With Substitute and Protect, it was incredibly adept at turning the tables on its usual counters, as the two moves combined with pressure drained the power points of the moves its checks tried to throw at it incredibly quickly. It didn't even need to get a Scald burn to dominate Ferrothorn anymore. It just run out of power whips with ridiculous ease. It could pull this trick against bulky anything, and the set quickly took over OU. Players absolutely loathed it. Suicune could dominate things one-on-one and seemingly had no business doing anything against. It's set up against seemingly anything, like Specs Latios locked into Psychic. Many called it the cheapest Pokemon around. Suddenly, Suicune was terrorizing OU like it never had before. It was the best sweeper available. Players were falling over themselves trying to figure out how to stop it, and it was so good, it would regularly manage to brute force its way through teams that even tried to go out of their way to beat it. For a time, the player base was genuinely stumped on how to stop it. Oh, but Suicune can run out of PP fairly quickly itself, right? Yeah, until it gets paired with Lunar Dance Cresselia, with Lunar Dance being like Healing Wish, except it also restores the PP, so you get a super free second Suicune. It was utterly nightmarish. Eventually, the metagame's focus on more offensive teams shifted the tier away from being completely dominated by Suicune. But all this meant was that Suicune was now merely an absolutely excellent Pokemon as opposed to a completely unstoppable one. It continued seeing use. Its impact was such that it received its own name. It was called Vincoon. And the strategy of using Substitute, Protect, and a boosting move on a Pokemon suddenly received the Vin prefix. For instance, DPP UU saw Entei start using a similar set, and it was referred referred to as Vinte. It was much like Crocoon all those years ago. So all in all, another stunningly successful generation for Suicune. When it arrived on the VGC scene in 2015, Suicune's playstyle took on a new dimension, and they had the daylight spammed out of it for how much utility it brought to its team. It could provide speed control, sure, but it also loved weakening the opponent's special attacks, not by boosting with Calm Mind, but with the better team support version of Snarl. This was massively helpful, especially as Suicune was so naturally adept at fending off physical attackers. It sometimes even took this special attack taking playstyle to another level with Assault Vest sets, making it much easier for it to maneuver around the various Thunderbolts and Mega Charizard-wise solar beams aimed at it. Assault Vest Suicune was on display on Jan Doek's team that they used to reach 10th place at the Arnhem Regionals, a tournament which also saw Barris Akos reach 6th with Suicune, while Mark McQuillan won with 1 in the senior division. With Suicune, Michael Flooding reached 4th, Kyle Timbrook reached 8th, Drew Norak reached 10th, and Leonard Kraft III reached 15th at the Missouri Regionals. Alejandro Jimenez reached 3rd, Noraz Bashir reached 7th, and Tracy McLaughlin reached 16th at the California Regionals. The late Angel Miranda reached 4th, Colin Hare reached 5th, Jared Fishkin reached 11th, Dan House reached 12th, and Jung Hoon Yun reached 14th at the Virginia Regionals. Devin Homer reached 6th, and Demetrios Kagaris reached 8th at the Oregon Regionals. David Mancuso reached 2nd, Adit Selvaraj reached 7th, Jeremy Kua reached 12th, and Franklin Sujo reached 14th at the Florida Regionals. Also using Suicune, Josua Marbun won Indonesia's first ever Premier Challenge. At the UK Regionals, Philip De Souza, Jamie Boyd, Stephen Gibbon, and Barris Akos reached 1st, 3rd, 4th, and 6th respectively. Barris also reached 3rd at the German Nationals, while Giovanni Milani won the Italian Regionals. Suicune was also everywhere at Mexico City Regionals, used by Miguel Lopez Moreno, Luis Alfonso Trujillo, Ruben Ulysses Lince, Fabian Chavez, and John Vukil to reach 1st, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 7th respectively. Kimo Nishimura reached 16th with Suicune at the Washington Regionals, while Victor Camacho reached 6th at Utah, and Carl Concepcion reached 8th at Georgia. Juan Nar won the Colombian Regionals with Suicune, and the Australian Nationals were loaded with Suicune as well. In the top 8, Lionel Price reached 4th, Ty Power 7th, and Phil Nguyen 8th. At the Japanese Nationals, Sharon aka Sharon Alex reached top 8, while Arch reached 9th at the US Nationals. At Worlds, Suicune appeared on Chen Chen Sai's top 8 team in the senior division, and in Masters division, it appeared at both the teams of the 22nd and 32nd place players, Nikolay Kucherenko and Jamie Boyd respectively. When 2016 came around, the presence of the primals and monsters like Xerneas meant Suicune pretty much disappeared. That said, Stefan Smiguk reached 8th with it at the US Nationals, and Andrew Norik did top cut with it at Worlds, so props to them. All in all though, Suicune had an extraordinarily eventful Gen 6 VGC career, despite not existing in the first year and being unviable in the third. That's how great its 2015 was. At the time Generation 7 started, Ora's Vincun Fever was just getting started, and the craze carried over into early Sun and Moon, where it was almost as obnoxious. The only thing keeping it from obliterating everything in the same ease was the fact that Burn was nerfed to 6.25% damage per turn, meaning it wasn't out damaging leftovers anymore, which meant Scald wasn't as terrifying a weapon. Though this was small comfort as Suicune did the exact same thing over and over. Oh sure, there was Haze Toxapex now, but this was where Suicune pulled out the nasty pressure stalling tactic it loved so much, and there were lots of Suicune Toxapex PP wars as a result. Players were tripping over themselves to stop Suicune safely at first. They were up in arms to degrees of mania, rivaling Oraz with this thing that threatened seemingly the whole game one way or another. Eventually, however, the metagame developed into a more offensive direction, and Suicune proved itself to be less overwhelming with the stronger, faster metagame compared to the previous generation. It was still a good Pokemon, no mistake about that, but it was more niche and less capable of taking over games with the ease it had in Oraz in this hard-hitting, faster-paced metagame with the likes of Kartana and Tapu Koko running around, among others. Though that wasn't to say that Suicune didn't occasionally show up and do some very nasty things, it just did them much more rarely, though that meant it was less expected, and what more horrible thing to run into unexpectedly than Vincun. After its initial wave of terrorizing OU, Suicune returned to UU, now ruled over by the likes of Pokemon it had previously shared OU with, Latias and Scizor. Their Vincun Suicune and Crocoon were as solid as ever, with traditional Suicune traits of being a special sweeper unafraid of Blissey, being able to take on physical attackers like Mega Aerodactyl, and generally being capable of running away with battles better than almost anything. That really was almost all there was to it. It was pretty much just good old Suicune, doing its usual Suicune things with its regular Suicune efficacy. It didn't dominate the tier or anything, because the meta was no longer as bulky water-centric as it had been previously, but Suicune was always there, without flash, putting in work and being a significant part of Gen 7 UU. Suicune continued to do its usual Suicune things in VGC as well. Speed control, weakening special attackers, scalding physical attackers, but its niche was more limited in this power crept metagame. Still, it was a decent choice, and when it was used, it was a valuable Pokemon to have. In 2018, its most notable showing was Jamie Boyd, who at this point is starting to seem like the #1 VGC Suicune fan, and who won the Malmo regionals with it. It provided Tailwind and Snarl support, but also did so while holding a Generation 7 item, Mago Berry, which was absolutely incredible for restoring its health. Ashton Cox also used Suicune, reaching 19th at Worlds with it. And that was all for 2018 Suicune, but in 2019, it would see quite an uptick in usage during the Ultra Series. Joshua Etsy reached 25th with it at the Santa Clara Regionals. At the Taiwan Special Event, Zhang Xin Lin came in 13th. At the second Lima Special Event, John Paul Lopez reached 5th. At the Guatemala Special Event, Enrique Gonzalez reached 3rd. Hang Yu Zhang reached 3rd as well. Boris Paradis reached 13th at the Santiago Regionals. Darivon Sufamination reached 63rd at the North American Internationals. And finally, James Mortimer reached 21st at the Sheffield Regionals. After the Ultra Series, the less restricted nature of the metagame dropped Suicune back into obscurity. But hey, it was better than nothing as far as Gen 7 VGC was concerned. Generation 8 was wild. Limited Pokedex, no Megas, no Z moves, Dynamax was banned. So did Suicune dominate OU again? Not quite, as the brutality of knockoff spam and the inability to run heavy-duty boots effectively without any form of recovery really held it back in comparison to the likes of Slowking. It didn't even fall to UU this time. It wound up in RU. As unfathomable a concept as RU Suicune was, it was reality. It was quite an excellent Pokemon there, to no surprise, with its stats towering over most of the tier, doing the same things it always did. Vincoon returned with a vengeance, though when Zarude and its irritating jungle healing were around, it often slot Ice Beam in over Protect. The tier had plenty of water immunities in Mantine and Gastrodon, but that was just fine. Vincoon would PP stall them with ease. Crocoon would also pop up on occasion. It could still sweep, of course, but by and large it was used for its greater physical bulk over Milotic, which made it much better at withstanding enormous hits from tier sluggers Darmanitan and Golurk. Whether with Sleep Talk or Roar, it was effective, with the latter being particularly helpful to give it maneuverability against its most annoying checks, Reuniclus, Milotic, and Celebi. Overall, it was much better after Zarude rose from the tier via usage. Suicune's Generation 8 was surprisingly uneventful, considering it was all the way down in RU, and in a generation with less Pokemon and no so-called gimmick at that. But hey, it was still a successful one. Suicune was once again niche with the occasional appearance in Generation 8 VGC, doing the same things it always had. Celine Benitez and Daria Walsh reached 13th and 18th respectively at the second Hatterene Series tournament, while at the third Players' Cup, Preston Duff tied for 13th place. In Series 9, Diana Bros came in 19th at the third Hatterene Series, while Boss Straff reached 12th at the Asia Players' Cup. In Series 10, the World Cup Open saw Luigi Aguirre, Fiona Simkovic, and Lorenzo Catazzoli reach 10th, 19th, and 23rd respectively. By the time 2022 rolled around though, Suicune wasn't even a niche pick anymore, though it still saw the sparsest uses, most notably from Fiona Simkovic, who came in 9th at the 5th Hatterene Series, and Alessio Yuri Boschetto, who used it to reach 28th at the Frankfurt International, and 17th at the Milan Special. Overall, Suicune's weakest VGC generation yet, but all things considered, not bad at all. At the time of this video, Suicune was just released in Generation 9 in the Indigo disc, but its distant cousin, Walking Wake, was released after a Pokemon Direct and has proceeded to unleash unprecedented terror on the OU metagame. It shares its mighty Water Dragon typing with Kingdra and Palkia, but it packs tools those beasts, even the legendary Palkia, would be envious of. It's got decent enough natural bulk, which would have been quite good in previous generations, but in Scarlet and Violet it's not so impressive. Still, it gets the job done for what was Wake's strengths. a superb base 125 special attack stat, and base 109 speed stat. The water part of its excellent stab combination is Hydro Steam. It comes in at a solid 80 base power. Hey, you know how most water moves are weakened in Sun? Yeah, what if there was one that got stronger in Sun? Yep, that's Hydro Steam, which jumps up to 120 base power under sunlight. Walking Wake was a sun-loving water type in other ways too, and not just because it could also unleash boosted flamethrowers, and later on weather balls, though that was delightful as well, the latter being especially nice for slamming some of the few Pokemon capable of taking it on, like Terra Fairy Clodsire. The main way it had fun in the sun though was as such, as a Paradox Pokemon. As a Paradox Pokemon, Walking Wake's Protosynthesis ability boosted its highest stat when it switched in under sun, so if it invested in 244 special attack EVs, still practically max, it could receive a +1 speed boost, letting it cleave through offense unstoppably, while with max special attack, it could receive a 30% special attack boost, making itself downright impossible to wall. If it terrestrialized water, even Blissey came dangerously close to being 2-hit KO'd by Sunny Choice Specs Hydro Steam. Having a Choice Specs Pokemon that regularly got its speed boosted, or got another boost in its special attack, was downright frightening. The minute it came around, Walking Wake was immediately one of the most feared controversial Pokemon in the tier, with many clamoring for its ban. It quickly received a suspect test, but it avoided the ban. On Sun teams, most agreed it was extremely broken, but only on Sun, whereas outside of Sun, it was quote-unquote only a very good Pokemon. It could run effective agility sets with booster energy or substitute and leftovers, which were potentially terrifying in the right matchup, but weren't as immediately capable of crushing everything like Sunny Wake was, whereas Sun teams themselves were also very good, but not overbearing, making it manageable overall. When the Teal Mask metagame came along, Wake got even better, receiving Knockoff to harass its counters even further. Goodbye heavy duty boots. Flip Turn allowing it to maintain momentum on many switches and force with more chip damage to boot, and Scald, because why not allow it to spread burns too? In spite of this, Walking Wake continues to be by and large a Sun Pokemon. It is simply at its best when clicking Hydro Steam over and over. It has already become one of the best, most defining Pokemon in Gen 9 OU. Walking Wake has also been quite decent in Ubers. Its speed wasn't as impressive, but when you've got the mighty Koraidon and later Groudon setting the sun for it, and your Hydro Steam rips through pretty much the entire tier, it's worth using. Wake's role is to break down opponents' defenses for faster Pokemon like Fluttermane and Scarf Koraidon to finish off, and it's excellent at this, as not much is withstanding its power, putting enormous pressure on even the likes of Eternatus with Sunny Hydro Steam, to say nothing of the fact that Eternatus is terrified of Draco Meteor anyway. Sometimes Walking Wake even runs a modest nature to fully lean into its role as a wall breaker. It's a more specific Pokemon in Ubers, but it's still highly effective and potentially devastating in the right hands. And that's it. So how great were Suicune and Walking Wake actually? Well, Suicune is one of the most elite OU Pokemon in generations 2 through 4. In 3, it particularly dominated, becoming famous for its so-called no weak Crocune set. It first appeared in UU in Generation 5, and there it was excellent, but returned to excellence in OU in Generation 6 when it briefly dominated the tier to brutal extents once Vincoon was discovered, a set that also started off as a terror in Gen 7 OU. Suicune continued to excel in UU in Gen 6 and 7, with a solid appearance in Gen 8 RU. Suicune just came out in Gen 9 at the time of this video, but Walking Wake has already had an incredibly eventful generation, narrowly avoiding a ban and redefining Sun with its signature Hydro Steam, even making its way into Uber's viability. Suicune's also had quite a great deal of success across multiple generations in VGC. There's pretty much nothing it can't do, singles or doubles alike, though at the time of this video, Walking Wake hasn't had a chance yet in VGC since it won't be allowed until Regulation F in January. But all in all, Suicune is one of the best Pokemon of all time, and Walking Wake is off to a great start. Thanks for watching, everyone, and as always, if you liked the video and you want to see more, be sure to subscribe to False Swipe Gaming for more weekly Pokemon content, and in the comments, I want to know, what do you think about competitive Suicune and Walking Wake? Whatever it is, let me know in the comments. Also, thank you so much to our patrons for continued support of our videos, and thank you to everyone else watching as well. And follow my crew in these social media platforms. And that's all I got. See you next time, everyone.